What's up, heathens? How ya doing? I'm the Godless Engineer, and I critically analyze apologists' claims to give you the best arguments and information so that you can stand up and use your voice. Today, we're going to be taking a look at this guy's video.
I suppose I would be willing to amend the title of this video to my favorite argument for the existence of God, because I'm not intellectually capable enough to be able to claim that this is the best or the most logically superior argument for God's existence. And it will certainly suffer from my feeble rendering of it. But of all the arguments that I've studied, I find this one to be the most persuasive and convincing because I think everybody can relate to it. It touches on every single person's experience of life, and it's also not terribly logically complicated, so I think most people can follow it.
Yes, of course, I'll tell them. Yeah. Obviously, yeah, I'm not an expert either. I'm not a philosopher or anything like that. I'm just some asshole on the internet. I got it. The lawyers would like me to say that I also am not an expert or anything like that, so there's no way for me to determine what's the best evidence either against God or for God. So I'm right there with you, pal. But today we're going to be getting into what his best evidence for God is. So if you want to know why he's wrong about this being the best evidence for God, then please stay tuned. Alright, heathens, well, it seems like we've all seen every single piece of evidence that apologists have for God, but this guy right here, Brian, he thinks he has what, in his opinion, is the best evidence for God. Now, it's going to be one of the already established arguments for God, it's just that he favors this one in particular. Keep in mind that all of these arguments ultimately stem from much older sources like Thomas Aquinas. And to kind of introduce you guys to Brian here, he's a Catholic and he has a Catholic-based YouTube channel where he gives advice to other Catholics as well as making videos about the existence of God and other things of that nature. So, if you happen to be a theist and watching this video, and you're a Catholic or you like Catholic-based videos, definitely go and check out Brian. Alright, Brian, let's see what you got for us today, huh?
So my hope is that a presentation like this will demonstrate to you that there are rational approaches to the existence of God and that faith can be complemented by reason, even if you've never experienced a preacher or evangelist or a faith community leader taking that approach. My hope is that you will be left with enough of a compelling impression that you'd be willing to explore this a little bit further, both intellectually and experientially. I said earlier that there are compelling atheistic arguments just as there are theistic arguments, but my experience of experimenting with and exploring the possibility of God's existence is what overwhelmingly tips the scales in that direction.
Okay, but you have to understand that everybody has different experiences, and if you can't replicate those experiences in any kind of scientific way, meaning that you can replicate the conditions and you can get an expected outcome, then I don't really think that you have any kind of evidence, and that evidence should not be compelling to anybody. I think that if God does exist, then it doesn't matter how each individual person experiences it. We should definitely be able to prove that it's true that he exists. So I guess we're starting off fundamentally different here, because you seem to heavily rely on your own subjective experience to inform what you think about reality, whereas I don't really rely on my personal subjective experience all that much. I try to verify things outside of my experience to make sure that they are truly representative of reality. Just to give you an example, if we have two rocks and then we put two more rocks down together, then we have four rocks. It doesn't matter what my experience is about this addition of two more rocks, because two rocks plus two rocks equals four rocks. That's as objectively true as we can get. It doesn't matter what everybody's individual experience is. That is as objectively true as we can get it.
Because my life has dramatically changed, and I would say improved, since I placed myself in a pattern according to Christian teaching. And by that, I don't mean that everything has gone my way since then, or that God has answered everything according to the way that I've asked for in prayer.
Oh, so you mean you regularly stone homosexuals in the streets? Or do you kill people of other religions? Do you think that it's completely sinful to have other religions practicing inside the United States, which I'm assuming is where you're based out of? Although I don't really know you all that much, Brian. I'm just kind of curious, what in the world do you mean by, you started following a Christian way of life? Because a Christian way of life has very different meanings depending on the time period that you're in. Currently, as far as a Christian way of life goes, means that you follow, I guess, what is the predominant Catholic idea of the Christian way of life, which doesn't include stoning homosexuals in the streets, nor does it include subjecting women to being just property, which is originally how Christians acted. Originally, Christians acted in the way of, killing otherwise guiltless people for doing nothing that affects other people, which would be, killing people for being a homosexual or for being part of the LGBTQ community in general. That's one thing. Also, keeping slaves. I'm guessing that you don't keep slaves. So my guess is that you're talking about the current type of Christianity that you're in when you started applying those current moral rules and moral values. But please tell me, what do you mean by applying a Christian way of life? But before we get into how Christianity changed your life for the better, I want to point out how this is the exact problem that I was talking about with personal, subjective experiences. Because while your life got better when you applied these principles of Christianity to your life, my life got immensely better once I shed the belief in a God. Do you see how personal experience really isn't evidence for anything?
What I do mean is that I've experienced a great deal more joy and hope and peace than I did before, and that I've endured struggles and distresses that the person I was before really would have struggled to negotiate. And I've also been freed from modes of behavior that I was really ashamed of.
I'm sorry, I don't understand why you need Christianity in order to shed behaviors that you're ashamed of. I mean, you can go to therapy for that shit. You can, do any number of other things other than becoming a Christian. I mean, hell, people could have that exact same experience becoming a Muslim or becoming a Jew. I mean, you could go with any religion and apply its tenets to that person, and that person could shed these behaviors that they are ashamed of. So it doesn't really seem like your experience of being able to overcome bad behaviors is evidence for your particular argument that you're going to get into. So I don't know why you're kind of leading us off with, oh, well, this is my experience. This is how good Christianity has been to me and how well it's improved my life, when it really doesn't matter how it affected you. We're trying to ascertain the truth value of it. The truth value of a particular idea does not necessarily correlate to making your life better. Something could be true and make your life worse.
And at the end of the day, I've discovered a life that I've found incredibly fulfilling because of my openness to those teachings. And if you're on the other side of two compelling logical alternatives, shouldn't the one that promises a great deal of hope and even eternal life create enough incentive for you to start exploring it with more consequence than mere speculation? Because if it's a toss-up at the end of the day, then I think it makes a lot of rational sense to bet on the possibility of God's existence and to start searching for him more earnestly. Every single person that I've said that to who took me up on that challenge was not disappointed, and I don't think you will be either.
So here again is where we're fundamentally different there, Brian, because at the end of the day, if it's a toss-up, a 50-50 thing, then I would lean more towards reality. I would lean more towards truth, is what I'm trying to say. I don't think that you should be compelled that something is true just because it offers you hope and eternal life. I think you should lean more towards the side that better represents reality. Now, if you feel that that is God exists and it's definitely the Christian God, then fine. At least you're not betting all of this on, oh, well, this makes me feel good over here. This makes me feel like shit. So I should definitely go with the one that makes me feel good, because not everything that makes you feel good is representative of reality, or is good for you, or is true. At the end of the day, with the 50-50 split between atheism and theism, I think that you would have to lean more towards atheism than theism, because of the fact that there's no evidence to support this idea that this God figure, this deity, ambiguous God deity, merely theism, exists. There's just simply no evidence out there that actually supports the conclusion that that God exists. So it seems more like atheism is more representative of reality. Now, prior to this, he kind of threw in a Pascal's wager, saying that, oh, it's safer to believe in a God because it gives you hope and eternal life afterwards. Pascal's wager is a really, really bad argument for God's existence. For one thing, you're only focusing in on Christianity versus atheism, and not Christianity versus Islam versus Judaism versus blah, 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 all of the different versions of theism out there. And then it's all of that versus atheism. So you have to understand why your particular definition of a God has a vanishingly small percentage of being correct compared to atheism. So already atheism is on a better foot with any specific definition of a God, but that's generally why I have this conversation and I talk about an ambiguous God deity in general, the merely theism type of God. All right, now that we're through this boilerplate stuff of his video, let's get to the meat of his argument.
I want to start out by setting the stage between two alternatives and to emphasize that you can't have it both ways, which is what too many of us try to get away with. The first option says that the physical universe, with its cosmos, planets, living things, matter, and the physical laws that govern those things, is all that there is. And so that any intellectual inquiry into truth or what is real should be limited to the scope of the physical sciences. The second option acknowledges the physical universe and everything I just described, but it broadens the scope of reality to include that which exceeds the physical universe and its fixed laws. And it recognizes that we have many experiences that indicate that there is far more than those fixed laws.
Well, again, we've already covered how experiences, personal, subjective experiences, are not necessarily representative of reality, so we cannot use them as evidence of what is true in reality. Well, we've already covered how personal, subjective experiences are not necessarily representative of what is true of reality. So we can't use them as evidence for what is true of reality. We would have to use something outside of our personal subjective experience in order to confirm this personal subjective experience. You see, this is a restriction that humans have. How we experience reality is definitely holding us back from knowing what reality actually is. Also, I don't see any evidence of anything outside of reality. Now, you could get into abstract thoughts and other emotions and morality and all this other stuff, things that we create, but we still create these things within our reality. They don't exist outside of reality. So there's nothing whatsoever that supports this idea that something supernatural exists. All that we have evidence for, all that we can truly know to exist, are the things that physically exist and that we can physically experience.
So to start exploring those two options, consider the fact that every human society that we have records for, every civilization, has nurtured some sort of moral code of behavior. And in many cases, like the entire developed world of today, those societies recognize the most critical aspects of that moral code in laws that inflicted punitive measures on anyone who transgressed that moral code. And no matter how much we philosophize and speculate about the existence of a universal code of moral behavior and try to liberate ourselves from it by claiming that there is no such thing, there's only what we happen to prefer. Everybody I know has tried to hold somebody else to some measurable standard of right and wrong. Everyone has objected when someone has wronged them, when they've cheated them or lied to them or abused them. And nobody would be satisfied with the retort, just because you don't like what somebody did to you doesn't mean it's actually wrong. That's just your preference.
Well, yeah, morality is just your preference. We all have our own moral code, but you see, the thing is that we've been living in these giant societies for so long that this moral code has somewhat become ingrained into us. You know, from the moment of our birth, we are taught a moral code by our parents. Our parents were taught a moral code by their parents, and so on and so forth. So, because we've been living in these societies for so long, it seems sort of innate to us that we shouldn't want to kill another person, or that it's bad to kill another person. But there is a small portion of any given population that does not have that innate knowledge. They don't have this knowledge that you shouldn't hurt another person for fun. These would be psychopaths and sociopaths. They don't understand these feelings because there's something chemically wrong in their brains. And it all ultimately devolves into chemicals in your brain. While it is all subjective and everybody has their own moral code, we as a society have agreed to a certain standard of morality that we have enshrined into laws. But this is because we all have this social contract that we've agreed to live by in order to live in a society. So the society controls what morality you ultimately have. Your parents control what morality you ultimately have. You control what your morality is. Eventually, later on in life. Well, I'm talking about children when it comes to parents. I mean, the society helps mold you in general, but you ultimately take the reins and you determine for yourself what is right and what is wrong. And then you use that in which to judge other people by. And you can be objective about your own moral code. That's true. But what most religious apologists are talking about at this point is like an absolute morality. Like he was saying in this particular section, he's talking about a single static moral code that has been given to us by this supernatural entity.
If good and bad is just a way of describing what you or I happen to prefer, then we would never have grounds to say that someone else should behave according to those preferences. We could never hold someone else accountable for their behavior because in order to do so, you have to concede that there is something objective and something neutral outside and apart from our preferences that mediates between us so that I can hold you accountable and you can hold me accountable when either of us mistreats the other.
Yes. Yes, honey, I know. He's a dipshit. No, yeah, I got it. Yes, society would be the entity outside of ourselves that we use to judge people's actions by. Yes, we individually we can judge other people's actions as being bad, and then our own personal subjective moral code is based on the society that we live in. Yes, honey, I know. Yeah, I got it. Thank you. All right. Bye. Love you. We obviously have something outside of ourselves that we can judge other people's actions as being bad. It would be the society that you live in, the laws that we lay down in our society. You're totally neglecting the fact that we all live in a society and people live within the same society that they're judging like good or bad. Now, there are instances of, well, this is bad. We judge another culture by our own standards and we say this is bad. But within that other culture, whatever bad thing we consider it to be, they don't consider it bad. Like if you just take a few hundred years ago, child brides were a perfectly normal thing. That was perfectly fine. Today, we find that to be abhorrent. It's because society and just the general population of the world have moved past that. Well, for the most part. There are some dipshits out there that still want to marry off young children as early as they can, but, they are on the fringes of society at this point. My point is that the society that you exist within gives you a basic sense of morality in which to judge other people's actions as good or bad by. But even within our own society here, we have certain laws that outlaw things that aren't necessarily good or bad. If you think back to the blue laws that were instantiated, the blue laws were not meant to target the LGBTQ community, but they were used to target the LGBTQ community and outlaw LGBTQ individuals, or at least their actions. And that's not inherently right or wrong. But you see, the thing is that the society that we exist in can have a different set of moral laws and values than we actually hold. But because we exist within this society, we make up the society, we can change that society. And that's happened multiple times throughout history.
And no matter what anybody says or what philosophy you subscribe to, all of us recognize this requirement, and all of our laws are premised upon this truth. Otherwise, all you would have to judge right and wrong are preferences, and then you would have no grounds to say that someone's preferences outweigh someone else's preferences, such that your preferences to not have your things stolen or to not be abused carry no more weight than someone else's preference to steal your things or to abuse you.
I don't see how this differs from the Christian point of view, though, because all you're saying is that God's preferences are above all of our preferences, so do what God wants you to do. But the problem is that all you have is some asshole speaking for God telling you what God really wants, and God is not communicating to you what he wants, so you're having to rely on this asshole that is taking God's word and manipulating it, probably, into whatever he wants. That's if a God were to exist. I don't think that a God does exist, so it's really just some asshole making up rules and saying, oh, my rules are better than everybody else's. I don't see how this section right here really differs from, the reality of us having a subjective moral opinion.
Unless there truly is an objective moral standard that we can appeal to judge our disputes and to hold each other accountable to. And the fact that we have laws concedes this fact that this moral standard does exist.
No, laws do not prove that an absolute moral standard of God exists. If you just take the United States, for example, United States Constitution and all of our laws are completely antithetical to the Bible, right? All of the laws do not favor the Bible whatsoever. I mean, you don't see mandated religion in our society, do you? Well, that's the first 4 commandments. You also don't see women being treated as property. You don't see a lot of things that are pretty bedrock in the Bible in the United States Constitution or the Bill of Rights or the amendments. So no, laws are not based on the Bible or this ultimate moral code given to us by a God, whether it's an ambiguous deity or not. We ourselves make up these laws because we have this shared goal of existing as a society, and we come together and we agree on what laws are to be made, and then those laws are made. Those laws are also overturned when we decide that we don't need those laws anymore, or those laws didn't make sense, or enough of a majority disagrees with the laws that are made. It's all very flexible as far as society and laws go. Now, if you want to look within your own religion, Christianity, you will see that not even Christians' absolute moral code is really all that absolute. If you take snapshots at various stages throughout history, you will find very different moral codes, and you will also see how they evolve over time. Generally, they evolve behind society. Like, society advances first, and then religion is drug along, kicking and screaming. So, any argument to an absolute moral code within any specific version of religion or any version of God just utterly fails with how our societies have changed over time and how this God's absolute word has changed over time.
But what are the implications of that? What are we talking about? What are we allowing when we talk about morality? Well, morality can be described as a judgment against what ought to occur and what actually occurs.
In respect to a person making a decision, that person makes a decision as to what ought to happen. There is no absolute oughts. That is the insinuation that I get out of what he's saying here, though, is that there are these absolute oughts. But what we find in reality is that there's no absolute oughts, because the absolute oughts that we have today may not be the same absolute oughts that exist tomorrow. They are definitely in flux. So it takes a person to denote what an ought should be.
For example, if somebody abuses their wife, we would be correct in saying you ought not to have done that. We're saying that the actions and decisions that led to that abuse were the wrong ones as compared to the right ones. We're evaluating what happened, in this case, the abuse, and we're comparing it to what ought to have happened, what should have happened, and saying that what actually happened should not have happened, and that the one who is guilty of committing the abuse is to some degree responsible and culpable for what happened.
Right, but transport yourself back a few hundred years and this abuse wouldn't be seen as abuse. You wouldn't see it as an ought not to happen. You would see it as just a normal everyday thing, like a man abusing his wife back in biblical days in the 1st century and all that would have been seen as just, oh, he's manhandling his property. We as a society have decided that abuse is not welcome and that it ought not to happen. We as a people have decided that. And beyond that, we've further refined what abuse actually is. It's never been God to denote what abuse is, which I would say if you just read the Bible, you would have a pretty good low bar for what abuse would be. It's pretty blatant that God abuses people in the Bible, but that's besides the point. My point is that we are the ones that determine what ought to happen and who is responsible, who is guilty for the actions that have been done. So ultimately, we are the deciders of these things.
Now, it's important to pause and recognize that the natural sciences as a method of inquiry cannot tell us anything about what ought to happen as compared to what actually happens. The natural sciences are limited to consideration about the natural universe and are predicated on the assumption that the natural universe behaves according to fixed laws. And by fixed laws, we mean what always happens. For example, the law of gravity describes what happens when two bodies of mass come within proximity to each other. There's no option to choose something outside of the laws that we're describing. A planet can't break faith with its orbit because it wants to go somewhere else. But remember, morality tells us what should happen and not necessarily what always does happen. Whereas science only tells us what does happen. It makes observations of what happens and then it draws conclusions from those observations.
I agree. Science can't necessarily say what ought to happen because we are the ones that use science to help us decide what ought to happen. We are the ones that make the decision, not God. Even when somebody says that it comes from God, they are the ones making the decision that it came from God and that whatever moral code that they're passing down is what ought to happen. So ultimately, it is always us, people, the organisms, that decide what ought to happen. Just because science is used as a tool to help us decide does not mean that, science is somehow unusable in determining a moral code or a moral standard. We should definitely use science to know that it's bad to beat the shit out of your wife. Somebody's health is a pretty good baseline for determining what could be considered bad and good. Smacking around somebody's wife is obviously bad because it damages the health of that person. But again, it depends on the moral situation. They could like that, being smacked around a little. But that further proves my point that it's subjective.
But if all there is the natural universe, then there's no grounds for talking about what should happen, only what does happen. And you and I, as fixtures of that natural universe, are also inevitably bound to those same fixed laws.
Citation fucking needed for this one. I don't understand why the physical world existing, and that's all we know to exist, I don't see how that precludes us from making moral decisions based on our own subjective moral standards. I don't understand why something supernatural has to exist in order for us to make moral decisions.
But with you and I, we notice that there's more going on than just fixed laws. We have an intellect and a will that governs the things that we do. We can choose between alternatives. And because of this ability, we recognize that we are responsible for the outcomes and the effects that we create through our will. We don't hold other natural elements or phenomena responsible for their actions. Like if a tsunami crashes ashore and kills hundreds of people, we don't denounce the ocean for its transgressions. We don't set up protests on shorelines and say, you need to recognize our human rights and dignity. And we certainly don't say, you shouldn't have done that.
Nah, all you gotta do is tweet thoughts and prayers on Twitter or post thoughts and prayers on Facebook or pray to your malevolent God that made it happen, because that's what your Bible says, that God made it happen. Now, if we're talking about an ambiguous deity type figure, I wouldn't blame that deity for tsunamis happening or anything like that. But I'm taking into consideration that you're a Christian, you believe in the Christian God, therefore thoughts and prayers on Facebook.
And the reason we don't do that is because we recognize that the ocean and everything that contributed to that disaster was behaving according to inevitable, deterministic, fixed laws of the natural universe.
Are they, or does God cause shit to happen? I mean, you gotta forgive me, I live in the South, North Alabama. So it's been drilled into my head that God causes natural things to happen, that God is ultimately responsible for all natural things that occur. I get that you're Catholic. I mean, I was Catholic too. I wasn't a very good Catholic, by the way. I mean, I've heard it all my life that God causes these things to happen. You hear it in politics all the time. God is punishing us with all these hurricanes because of gay sex down in Louisiana, Florida, Texas, Mississippi, I guess. I mean, we've heard this time and time again, so I'm just kind of curious, which one is it? It's either deterministic and God does not control nature, or God controls nature and he's doing this shit to us. I feel like you have to pick one or the other.
But when a person behaves in ways that we don't like, we don't say, oh, he's just behaving according to the fixed laws of nature. No, we say he is responsible for those decisions because he is governed by more than those fixed laws. He has some agency and ability outside of those fixed laws, and that he is free from those fixed laws to some degree.
I don't understand why you think that just because somebody is operating because of the fixed laws of nature, i.e. the chemicals that are interacting in your brain, everybody is just absent of responsibility. For all that I can tell, Christianity specifically absolves you of any responsibility for anything that you do. Now, you may consider that to be bad theology, but when I look at the theology that's contained within the Bible, that's what I'm reading. As long as you believe in Jesus as far as the Son of God, and you got to believe in him in order to get into heaven, then you can go to heaven. Of course, that's a very Protestant view of it. I understand that you're Catholic, so you may not consider somebody to be believing in Jesus and automatically get into heaven. You could still think that they could get into hell, or go to hell. I understand that you most likely think that way, but then again, I don't know you, so I'm not going to try to speculate about what you believe personally. I'm just saying that all of this is very, very confusing, and everybody has all of their different subjective ideas about personal responsibility as far as it pertains to religion and this absolute moral standard that God has. We as a society, we as a group of people have determined that people that commit these things that we have considered collectively to be bad, they will suffer the consequences of their actions. Just like in the instance of very high-powered people in the United States now, not all of them suffer the consequences of their actions. Many of them are allowed to just go free and wreak havoc on people.
But if the natural universe can only be described within that understanding of those laws and cause and effect, but we either inherit or produce a quality that breaks free from those laws and that sequence, then we have to admit that we've found something that is pervasive in the human experience and which exceeds or transcends the natural universe. In other words, there is something that is morality that is relentlessly available to our perception and to our experience that portrays something more to reality than what we can see, taste, and touch. There's something metaphysical and spiritual in our experience, and it's a big part of our experience.
I mean, maybe metaphysical, because that's kind of a philosophical thing where you're talking about abstract concepts, but definitely not spiritual. All this means is that every human on earth experiences this moral code, or has a moral code. But I would also say that there are many animals that have very basic moral foundations out there. You see this in dogs and dolphins and, sometimes whales, other things like that. Monkeys, you see these very basic moral foundations. I feel like there's a gradient in nature for a moral foundation. that as your brain proceeds to evolve into a more complex system, you start developing this sense of self, these in a moral foundation. I don't feel like we're all that special, considering that other animals in the animal kingdom also have these experiences. It also doesn't speak to some ultimate moral code, because we all have our own personal subjective moral code. Just because our societies have evolved to a point where we can all agree on some moral foundation doesn't mean that everybody within that society holds to that moral foundation. And it also doesn't mean that that moral foundation is absolute and exists across all of humanity. We have different moral codes that exist in different cultures, in different regions of the world. So with all of that subjectivity, you're still hard up on the idea that there's an absolute moral code, but even that absolute moral code of God seems to change over time. It seems to change as we change.
In other words, this something more, goodness and morality, was always characterized as a transcendental in classical thought. It transcends the natural universe. And if we're going to know or understand anything about it, we need to broaden our narrow-minded scope to admit and to explore metaphysical or spiritual reality. So now that we can understand that there is something, the moral standard or the law of right and wrong, that transcends the natural universe, what does that tell us about what lies beyond physical nature?
Absolutely nothing, because there's nothing that extends beyond nature, as far as we can tell. It doesn't tell us anything, because there's nothing that we know of that extends beyond nature. You think that morality is transcendental because it's an abstract thing. But that's not actually the case, because it definitely exists within this reality. We are the ones that hold these moral codes. Without us, this moral code would not exist. Without living organisms, I would say, because it's more than just us that have these moral foundations, as I laid out before. So without a living organism, a moral code does not exist. So does that mean that without living organisms, a supernatural world does not exist? We want to find out, absent of our experience, what actually exists. And that does not extend, for all that we can tell, past the natural world.
It tells us that whatever lies beyond is intensely interested in our behavior, in right and wrong, in unselfishness and justice. And it seems to be instructing us in becoming more moral by affirming us in our good behavior and making us feel uncomfortable or ashamed about our bad behavior.
Does it? I mean, if you just look at the Catholic faith, I really don't think the whole bad behavior makes you ashamed of it. Even at the very beginning of this video, you said that you needed Christianity to shed some behaviors that you were ashamed of. So does being ashamed automatically correct your bad behavior? It doesn't seem like it. It seems like people do things that they're ashamed of, regardless of whether or not it makes them feel ashamed. How does that factor into your whole idea of an absolute moral code? Because I don't see how it does. I see us as a society determining that these things should make us ashamed. I see us individually determining whether or not these things make us feel ashamed, or that we should be ashamed by these behaviors.
The only thing we can compare it to is a mind with will and purpose and intention. We can't talk about matter as if it's guiding or instructing us, and we certainly can't talk about it like a natural law, because as we've already seen, natural laws don't give allowances for us to disobey. And the fact that we can disobey and aren't forced to conform ourselves to these moral instructions, that tells us a little bit more, I believe. It makes love, or the free gift of self, possible. Like, what good are marriage vows if the one reciting them is forced to do so? And what good is a promise if it can't be broken? Love acquires its significance because it doesn't have to be given. That's what makes it so amazing when someone chooses to love us. So this power behind the moral law, it doesn't impose, it doesn't force the moral law on us, and it makes love possible, which leads us to a very personal perception of whatever it is that lies beyond the natural universe.
Love is a chemical reaction that happens in your head, and you don't choose who you love. I mean, you either love somebody or you don't. It's not necessarily a choice. I know that you want to hold on to this romanticized idea that, people, choose who they love and all this other stuff. Really, this falls into the whole LGBTQ kind of conversation because you don't choose who you fall in love with, okay? I mean, it just happens, and you don't necessarily control that. You can't force yourself to love somebody when you don't really love them. You could fake it. You could definitely do that, but that doesn't mean that you're choosing to love that person. It means that you're choosing to lie about how you feel about that person. So I don't know how all of this really factors into the whole morality conversation. I don't know how moral codes existing means that love can exist now. I don't understand any of this talk at all.
Now, a quick house cleaning item before we wrap up. This narrative and argument isn't designed to consider or assert anything specific about God. It's not meant to propose Christianity or any other theological framework. It's only designed to assert the existence of God and nothing else. Anything else you'd want to say about God would have to be considered in another set of arguments.
Well, then I don't understand the entire point of this video, because you have to go through a specific definition of God in order for this argument to make sense. Because otherwise you're just saying, well, morals exist, therefore God exists. And then it's like, well, what morals? What is the absolute moral code that you speak of? That leads us nowhere. Like, it doesn't get us to an actual God. It doesn't get us to a deity. It doesn't even get us to the supernatural. This all just seems pointless. The argument from morality seems more pointless now to me than it did before I recorded this video.
So all I've done here is followed a logical sequence of premises which draw the conclusion that there is something that exceeds or is outside the natural universe, which is deeply concerned with our moral behavior, and with all of those variables combined is best described or is most reminiscent of a mind.
I disagree. I don't think that the moral argument actually gets us anywhere close to a deity figure existing, because of the fact that while morality and other metaphysical concepts are abstract, we create those abstract things, and therefore they exist within this reality, so they don't transcend reality. They're not supernatural things. They are definitely grounded in reality because we create them. We are ultimately responsible for a moral code being developed. Without living organisms being alive and making these moral decisions, morality simply wouldn't exist. And if what you say is true, then that means that the supernatural wouldn't exist without living organisms being here. Well, heathens, that's all for his video. I really appreciate you guys joining me today to really analyze this. I'd love to hear what you guys think about his argument down below, which is ultimately the moral argument. What do you think about the moral argument? Do you think that it's good evidence for an ambiguous deity figure, or do you think that it's a very poor piece of evidence for God? Let me know down below. Hey, while you're down there, why don't you smash that like button and subscribe if you like this kind of video. Don't forget to stand up and use your voice. Bye, heathens.